Tonight, the language surrounding the war in Ukraine has become even more severe. A warning emerged connected to Russia's statements about ceasefires, and the message carried an unmistakable sense of danger directed toward the center of Ukraine. The warning was blunt: leave the city. Those words now sit at the center of international attention after Russia threatened what was described as a massive missile strike aimed at the center of Ukraine following double ceasefire declarations. And immediately the contrast became impossible to ignore. On one side, declarations involving ceasefires. On the other, threats involving missiles. That contradiction alone has intensified concern around the situation tonight. Because ceasefires are generally associated with pauses in violence, reductions in military activity, moments where civilians may briefly experience relief from fear and uncertainty. But here, the discussion surrounding ceasefires arrived together with warnings of major strikes. And that changes the emotional atmosphere entirely. It changes how every sentence is heard. It changes how every announcement is interpreted. And across Ukraine, words like massive missile strike are not abstract political language. They carry immediate emotional weight because they are tied directly to civilian safety, daily routines, transportation, communication, and survival itself. That is why the phrase "leave the city" resonates so sharply tonight. Short words, direct words, words that instantly create images of fear, urgency, and uncertainty. And as these warnings spread publicly, attention has turned once again toward the ongoing pressure faced by Ukrainian cities during this war, particularly central urban areas, particularly symbolic locations, particularly places where civilians continue attempting to maintain ordinary life despite extraordinary conditions. There is something especially chilling about warnings that arrive alongside discussions of ceasefires. Because normally a ceasefire signals temporary stillness, even if fragile. Even if uncertain, it at least suggests the possibility of reduced danger. But in this case, the warning itself became one of the loudest parts of the announcement. And that reality has changed the tone surrounding the entire situation. The phrase "double ceasefire declaration" already suggests a complicated and tense environment, multiple announcements, multiple signals, multiple layers of uncertainty, and then came the threat, a massive missile strike directed toward the center of Ukraine. The scale implied by those words is significant on its own, but emotionally the impact grows even larger when paired with the instruction for people to leave the city, because warnings directed at civilians immediately alter the emotional gravity of any conflict. They move conversations away from diplomatic language and directly into questions of safety and survival. That shift is impossible to overlook tonight. And in Ukraine, where cities have endured years of war-related fear and disruption, warnings involving missiles and urban centers carry a very particular weight. People hear those statements differently now, not theoretically, personally. They think about streets they recognize, buildings they know, neighborhoods they pass through every day, families, children, public spaces. And so even before any action occurs, the words themselves reshape the emotional landscape. That is what is happening tonight as these warnings circulate publicly. At the same time, the broader contradiction remains deeply striking. Ceasefire declarations traditionally communicate restraint. Missile threats communicate escalation. And when both appear together, confusion and anxiety naturally intensify. You know, wars are often measured not only by physical destruction, but by the emotional pressure created before anything even happens. Public warnings can change behavior instantly. They can empty streets, silence cities, alter routines, and tonight the words themselves are already carrying enormous force. The center of Ukraine has become the focus of the warning. That phrase matters because central areas often represent more than geography alone. They are symbolic locations, administrative locations, civilian locations, and references to those spaces immediately attract global attention because people understand what it means when the center of a city is mentioned in connection with missile strikes, even without additional details, even without further explanation. The emotional meaning arrives immediately. And tonight, that meaning hangs heavily over everything else being discussed. There is also the issue of timing. The warning followed ceasefire declarations. That sequence matters because it shapes how the entire situation is perceived publicly. Instead of creating calm, the declarations appear connected to growing tension and public alarm. That contrast has become one of the defining elements of this moment. The idea of ceasefires normally creates expectations of temporary quiet. Instead, tonight's language has intensified fears surrounding possible escalation, and Ukraine remains at the center of all of it. Throughout this war, Ukraine has repeatedly faced periods where announcements and threats arrive almost simultaneously. Public statements become part of the conflict itself. Every word carries strategic and emotional consequences. Every warning echoes far beyond official channels. Every phrase reaches ordinary people trying to navigate daily life under extraordinary pressure. That reality cannot be separated from this moment. Because when officials use terms like massive missile strike, civilians hear more than political rhetoric. They hear uncertainty about what tomorrow may bring. And when warnings instruct people to leave the city, the emotional impact deepens further. Sometimes fear arrives long before the sirens. That quiet feeling sits underneath tonight's developments. And still, amid all of this, the ceasefire declarations remain part of the conversation, which creates a deeply uneasy contradiction. The language of pauses, the language of threats, both operating side by side. That is what makes tonight's situation feel so tense and unstable. Ukraine continues standing in the middle of that pressure. A country already carrying the burden of war now faces another moment where public warnings and military language dominate the atmosphere surrounding civilian life. And because the warning specifically references a massive missile strike, attention naturally turns toward the scale implied by that wording. The phrase itself is designed to communicate severity, to communicate danger, to communicate consequences. And internationally, those words immediately command attention because missile threats involving major urban areas are never treated lightly. Not by governments, not by civilians, not by the wider world watching events unfold. There is also something notable in the stark simplicity of the phrase, leave the city. It is direct, urgent, immediate. It does not sound like distant diplomacy. It sounds personal. And perhaps that is part of why the phrase is spreading so quickly, because simple warnings often carry the strongest emotional force, especially during wartime, especially when cities are involved, especially when civilians are listening. As the situation develops, the emotional tension continues to grow around the relationship between ceasefire language and military threats. The two now exist together in the public conversation, shaping reactions inside Ukraine and beyond. And tonight, that contradiction feels impossible to escape. A ceasefire declaration followed by warnings of a massive missile strike aimed at the center of Ukraine. That is the reality now dominating international attention. For Ukrainians, these are not distant headlines. They are statements connected directly to daily existence under the shadow of war. Every warning becomes part of the emotional rhythm of life during conflict. And tonight, the atmosphere surrounding these developments feels especially heavy, especially uncertain, especially fragile. People hold their breath when cities are named. That feeling is impossible to ignore right now. The center of Ukraine remains under the glare of global attention tonight as fears grow around the meaning and implications of these warnings. And while ceasefire declarations were expected to lower tensions, the language surrounding them has instead produced a new wave of concern, a wave built not around calm, but around fear of what could come next. The emotional center of this moment is no longer the ceasefire declarations themselves. It is the warning that followed them. A warning involving what Russia described as a possible massive missile strike on the center of Ukraine, accompanied by the stark instruction telling people to leave the city. And tonight, that warning continues to dominate the atmosphere surrounding the conflict, because once language like that enters public discussion, it changes everything around it. Streets feel different. Silence feels different. Even ordinary routines begin carrying an undercurrent of uncertainty. That is the reality surrounding Ukraine tonight as these statements continue spreading across international headlines. The ceasefire declarations remain part of the broader situation, yes, but emotionally, attention has shifted toward the threat itself, toward the implications of a strike described as massive, toward the meaning of warnings directed at populated urban areas. And that shift has intensified concern far beyond military circles alone. Because the center of Ukraine is not simply a strategic phrase. It refers to places where civilians continue trying to live normal lives despite years of conflict. Offices remain open. Transportation systems continue operating. Families continue gathering in homes and public spaces. Life continues, and that is precisely why warnings involving cities create such profound emotional reactions. You know, wartime announcements often become deeply personal the moment civilians picture familiar places inside the language being used. Once cities are named, the conflict no longer feels distant. It feels immediate. And tonight, the instruction to leave the city has created exactly that kind of emotional gravity. The phrase is simple, but simplicity can be powerful, especially in moments involving danger, especially when missiles are mentioned alongside populated areas, especially when people are already living under the pressures of war. Across Ukraine, the emotional weight of these warnings cannot be separated from the broader reality civilians have already endured throughout this conflict. Air raid alerts, uncertainty, military threats, and disruptions have become woven into daily life in ways difficult to fully explain from the outside. And so when another warning emerges publicly, particularly one involving the possibility of a massive missile strike, people listen with heightened seriousness, not because the wording is dramatic, but because the consequences behind those words feel real. That distinction matters enormously tonight. There is also the continuing contradiction surrounding the ceasefire declarations themselves. Normally, ceasefires suggest a temporary lowering of danger. Even brief pauses in fighting can create moments where fear softens slightly, where uncertainty relaxes, where civilians breathe differently. But this moment has unfolded in the opposite direction. The declarations did not reduce tension. The warnings intensified it, and that has become the defining emotional reality surrounding the situation now. Sometimes the emotional meaning of an announcement is shaped less by what is promised and more by what follows immediately afterward. And here, the ceasefire language was quickly overshadowed by warnings of missiles and direct instructions involving cities. That sequence changed everything. Because once the conversation shifted toward potential strikes on the center of Ukraine, the emotional focus naturally followed. Fear tends to move faster than reassurance during war, and tonight that truth feels painfully visible. The phrase massive missile strike itself carries enormous force. The wording communicates scale, it communicates severity, it communicates the possibility of widespread impact. Even without additional details, people understand the seriousness implied by that phrase. And when paired with an instruction to evacuate or leave urban areas, the psychological effect deepens dramatically because civilians begin imagining what those warnings could mean for ordinary life: transportation, communication, shelter, family members, basic safety. That emotional chain reaction begins almost immediately once such warnings become public. And tonight, Ukraine is once again standing inside that atmosphere. The center of Ukraine remains at the center of global concern because urban spaces carry symbolic and human significance simultaneously. They are places of governance, commerce, community, and national identity. And in wartime, references to urban centers immediately resonate worldwide because people instinctively understand the vulnerability of cities, particularly civilian cities, particularly capitals and central regions, particularly places already marked by the strain of prolonged conflict. That understanding now shapes the international reaction surrounding these developments. At the same time, the phrase double-ceasefire declaration continues to linger in the background of the discussion. Multiple declarations suggest complexity, overlapping signals, and uncertainty about intentions. But despite that complexity, one thing has become very clear tonight. The warnings have overtaken the ceasefire language emotionally. The fear surrounding possible strikes now dominates public attention. People remember the warning long after the announcement fades. That quiet truth feels present in every discussion surrounding these developments tonight. And for Ukrainians, the emotional burden of repeated warnings can become exhausting in ways difficult to measure publicly. because every threat forces civilians to once again confront uncertainty about safety and stability. Every new warning revives fear. Every mention of missiles revives tension. Every reference to cities revives concern for ordinary people simply trying to continue daily life. That emotional reality now hangs heavily over Ukraine tonight. There is also a broader psychological effect when warnings become public before events unfold. Anticipation itself becomes part of the pressure. The waiting becomes part of the fear. People begin monitoring updates constantly, listening closely, watching carefully, and in wartime, uncertainty alone can reshape the emotional atmosphere of entire cities. That is part of why these developments feel so serious tonight, even before any further action occurs. Because words themselves carry consequences during conflicts. Warnings alter behavior. Warnings alter emotions. Warnings alter public mood. And tonight, the instruction to leave the city has become one of the most emotionally charged phrases surrounding this situation. Meanwhile, Ukraine continues to present itself as enduring under pressure despite these warnings. The country remains at the center of a conflict where public statements often carry immediate emotional and political consequences. And throughout all of this, civilians remain the silent focus behind every warning involving cities and missiles. That human reality remains impossible to separate from the language now dominating headlines, because every mention of a strike on urban areas ultimately points back toward ordinary people living inside those spaces, ordinary people trying to continue their lives. Ordinary people listening for updates. Ordinary people measuring risk in real time. And tonight, that reality feels especially raw. The emotional intensity surrounding these developments has also been amplified by the contradiction built directly into the situation itself. Ceasefire declarations usually suggest pauses. Missile threats suggest escalation. The coexistence of both messages has created deep unease, and that unease continues growing tonight. As the world watches closely, attention remains fixed on the center of Ukraine and the warnings now surrounding it. Every new statement is being examined carefully. Every phrase is carrying unusual weight, because during war, language itself can become part of the battlefield. And tonight, the language surrounding Ukraine feels heavy with fear, uncertainty, and pressure. Very heavy, very uncertain, very tense. Even quiet streets can feel loud with fear. That feeling now surrounds these developments as Ukraine faces another deeply anxious moment under the shadow of war. The ceasefire declarations may have been intended to shape the conversation initially, but tonight it is the warning of a massive missile strike and the chilling instruction to leave the city that continue echoing most powerfully across Ukraine and beyond.